Hi, thank you everyone. I'm worried that I will be too quiet, so just tell me if you can't hear me. Yeah, thank you very much for introducing me. I'd just like to start by thanking Rosie for inviting me. It's a huge honor to be speaking here, especially since it's a faculty event. And to be talking alongside esteemed faculty members, especially. I think Dr. Rublack was also going to speak here, and I had a small anecdote to share, which was that I didn't think she would remember this, but in 2012, I came here on an access trip. It was like state schools from Leeds could send students that were interested in history to come, and I came and I sat opposite her at the lunch, and I think she was talking to me and she said probably just courteously and generously that I should apply, but I took that very personally and decided that, you know, despite never having thought Cambridge for someone like me, that I would apply. So, you know, you can pass that on to her. But I think that symbolizes how significant this feels to me to have been invited here tonight to a faculty event, and particularly one where we're talking about women and women making history, which is something very close to my heart. So I'm going to start by making a bold assumption that many of you, like me, and I attest to doing this too, when we think of women, especially in making history, especially in the Cambridge environment, we don't think of women who look like me. And that's why I'm very glad to also have been invited here tonight. I think when we think about women making history, we often celebrate the successes of women, right? And we celebrate how far women have come, and in this institution particularly, but we fail to specify which women, right? And actually, I would argue that this isn't, I think calling it a failure is perhaps wrong, and we actually have to ask why we don't specify, what is hidden or made invisible by not specifying, right? What power processes and dynamics. And for me, the processes and dynamics that are hidden are class and race. In my experience of being a woman, and especially in this space, I can't ignore race and being visibly a Muslim person. That is what my womanhood is to me, right? But when I was asked to come here today and talk about my experiences of being a woman, you know, that's like, they're unavoidable, they're enmeshed. And I will talk a little bit, since Rosie asked me to, about my experiences of kind of making history in being here, I guess, and also in writing my dissertation. But yeah, I think I do have to say, you know, just in terms of being true to myself, that, you know, I do feel sometimes as a university we're able to celebrate certain types of diversity, but not others. And it can lead to this situation where we think of people as exceptions. And I would hate for anybody to think that I'm an exception in any way, because that's certainly not the case. And just because there aren't people who look like me filling this room, I think we have to maybe ask why that is, rather than to put the onus on me being in any way different. So yeah, when we sit in rooms like this and celebrate our making history, we can sometimes reinforce the idea, I think, that some people just don't make it, right? Maybe because of some sort of cultural failure or intellectual incapacity. And that's why I think such celebrations can actually reproduce the exclusions that we're trying to, you know, highlight. When we celebrate women, we're trying to highlight that history has been written predominantly by and about men. But in our celebration, some people remain excluded, right? So I do have to lay responsibility, I think, also with, just as a university, I would like to say I think it's important that they do more actively to be accessible to particularly people of colour born in Britain, in this country. And yeah, that's something I just have to say to be true to myself, and that's where I start with that. But in terms of the theme tonight, women making history, since I don't have long, I will focus on my experience of studying history and then kind of making history, right? So so to start with my experience, I'm not sure how many of you will be familiar, but there is a group at Cambridge called FLY, and it's a sort of social and political space for women of colour at this university. So one day we were talking about what it's like just, you know, being a student here, and this sort of complex feeling we had about the fact that in our existence here we were making a history in a way, right? So for me, that this entailed the fact that, so my grandparents migrated to Bradford from Pakistan in the 1960s, and I think particularly as migrants from you know, an ex-British colony, there's this kind of aspiration and emphasis and value placed on British education and obtaining a British education. And so to get to Cambridge, to be at Cambridge, felt like this really valuable, successful, celebration-worthy event, right? And it was like, this really esteemed thing, and something that I felt was the culmination of other people's labors, like the people before me. And this was something that the other girls at Fly were agreeing with and we were talking about. But the complexity of the feeling was that added to this celebratory feeling was the experience of actually being here, which was, and speaking for myself now, was difficult in ways that there isn't often a language to articulate it in. So difficult in the sense of often feeling yourself to be the only person of color in a room or the only visibly Muslim person in a room, which doesn't necessarily have to be difficult in itself, but it means that I think your subsequent actions and words become not just examples of what a person of color or a Muslim does, but exemplary, right? It becomes the example. And I think that puts a burden on existence that people don't necessarily recognize or know what that can do for your experiences in a place for over 3 years. And in my final term, actually, and this is the reason I highlight it, because it's not just something I it's not sort of very like vain idea I have about myself, but it's something people have said to me. And in my final term here, my friend Ben, he said to me in my third term, it was just kind of like an offhand comment, but he said, "I wonder how many people at Cambridge would never have met a Muslim if you hadn't come here." And at first I thought that was absurd, but the more I thought about it, and so I saw how sincere he was, it did make me think, and I think that's just something that has been really important to my experience of being a woman here, or making history as a woman here. In terms of research then, I was sort of guided by this complex feeling of having a special chance of being here, of being very grateful to the people before me, and but also kind of by this alienation and by the fact that all the history I had studied, in all of that, I had never come across a history of myself. So when it came to choosing my dissertation, it was very easy for me to decide that the one history I wanted to make was the history of myself, right? So to me, that history is the history of the women who came before me. So these were women who predominantly, the way they had been seen is only as victims and only as victimized. But in my world and in my life, were so much more than that, multifaceted and complex characters. So the dissertation I wrote, the title was The Experiences of First Wave Female Migrants from Pakistan to West Yorkshire between 1960 and 80. And I decided to use oral histories to let the women tell me their own stories, because they had been so often told by others. But also because going to the archives, there was nothing about these women, right? They didn't have the textual kind of documents that we keep in archives. They didn't have, no one had really written about them apart from as mothers and as wives, right? They were never like autonomous people in of themselves. And I think that made me also begin to question the kind of what it means for us to privilege certain archives and certain documents in some ways, and what really what else is going on there when we do that. So, but even though I used oral histories, I will say that I had a lot of angst regarding the research and regarding my making of history, because translating these oral interviews, which were conducted not in English, into English, and then also translating them into the sorts of arguments and vocabulary that would make my work academically worthy and valuable, often made me wonder about the cost of making something history, and when history refers to a certain type of knowing the past. Because after all, so, writing this dissertation wasn't making this history. This was a history that I knew already. The women who existed knew it, and they were histories that had been told many times before, that I'd heard, like in my grandparents' living room. I knew these histories. So when making it history, I worried that all I was doing was making it, academically palatable, and in so doing, making it less theirs. And I remember like writing and kind of making arguments about the things they'd said, and then asking myself and really having to reflect in a different way. But because I was in the process, because I was an undergrad, I decided it was worth doing this. Because for as long as people, read books to study history in this university, if the histories of people like me aren't in those books, they won't be known as histories. And if those women's existences aren't known as history, to me that's not only an injustice to them, but to me. So I remember when I printed out my dissertation, I held like the bound copy. It did feel quite momentous, and I hoped that in some way that like bundle of paper could stand in defiance of the silence and as a testament to the fact that I was here. And that maybe two histories have been made in a sense, and that I've been told that my dissertation is in the CV. I don't know if that's true, but if it is, I would like to think that it represents a corner of my grandparents' living room that was never supposed to be known, right? And I think also, the other thing that was important to me in writing that dissertation was that in a place where I had so often been defined and decided before I could speak, so people asked and assumed and constantly about my identity, it was also a small victory to just have been the author of my own story, and one which defied the voyeurism of previous authors, and proved that the experiences of those women were multifaceted and shaped much more by their own choices and by structural things like racism and sexism, rather than just a culture which made them shy and submissive. And I am coming to an end now, but I'd just like to read a little excerpt from my acknowledgements page in my dissertation. This was the page I took out actually when I submitted it because it would have been too obvious that I was very emotionally involved in my work, but I put it back in afterwards. And I opened with this, which is, I begin by thanking my nanny, that's my maternal grandma. Growing up, seeing her poise, bravery, fierce intelligence, wit, and fearlessness inspired me to write this dissertation. It inspired me to write for a generation of women who now hobble along grey northern streets in their Slovakia muses and are so often passed by, ignored, erased, and silenced so you'd never know what they'd gone through to be here. This dissertation is a tribute to them, every single one of them. So just to close, finishing off and fast forwarding to now, Rosie asked me to mention what sort of history I'm making now, I guess. I'm studying at Cellars, as Sarah said, and coming to decide my dissertation topic at the moment, which I haven't done, but I do need to. I run a blog, as Sarah said, and I started writing that at Cambridge, and it's very predominantly focused on Cambridge at the beginning, but it's more extensive now, and it does have a wider readership, which is exciting, and means that I've managed to participate in kind of events and things like that, talking about this kind of thing, I guess. Apart from that, I don't really have any plans for the next year, so this is history being made as we speak. Woo!